Hello all, I'm Jihae from the Human-Computer Interaction Group at KU Leuven, Belgium. Today I'm excited to present Meaning Follows Purpose, Unraveling the Architectural Design Conventions in the Contemporary Metaverse, which we worked on together with our co-authors Andrew Vande and Adalberto Simeone. To begin, what is the metaverse? Coined in Neil Stephenson's 1992 novel, Snow Crash, the metaverse was conceived as a fully immersive virtual environment that allowed millions of users to interact with each other, different from reality yet nevertheless hosting many of its societal intricacies. Yet the idea of the metaverse has since continued to evolve with many distinct perspectives, envisioning what is, what shapes, and what should be considered a metaverse. Considering the lack of an unanimous definition of the metaverse, at least for the context of this paper, we distilled 5 features that distinguishes a virtual world be part of the metaverse. To be real-time, where users can experience time as they would in real life. To be persistent, meaning that the virtual world continues to operate even without the user's presence, allowing for the creation of lasting virtual communities. To be social, where users engage with each other in a shared virtual environment. To be immersive, where user interaction is supported by, but not limited to, VR technology, especially considering that the virtual worlds of today are gradually moving towards ubiquity, that is, to be accessible through any device. And authorable, where users can modify or create virtual content. Taking one step back, architects were already fascinated with designing for a virtual universe since the conceptualization of cyberspace in 1982, which envisioned the first versions of the internet as a virtual 3D navigation and communication space. They used the city as a literal metaphor for navigating and browsing through the internet, or imagine liquid spaces that constantly varied their position over time and according to abstract information. As the internet remained two-dimensional, however, these hypothetical cities never manifested, and the need for architectural design never truly materialized until around 2022. When interest in the metaverse burgeoned and architectural firms were being actively involved with the bespoke design of metaverse spaces. Thus, now looking into the insights of architectural design of metaverse and social VR spaces from the perspective of HCI research, I Am a Mirror Dweller has shown that the use of mirrors in virtual reality environments incites bolder behaviors and self-perception. Drifting Off in Paradise, which investigates social sleep in VR, indicated that users typically prefer virtual environments with soft lighting or the sound of rain. And Towards a Metaverse Workplace suggests that the ability to customize spaces could potentially support work culture and engagement. We thus conducted a 3-phase study to investigate how architectural experts critique the design of today's metaverse. Firstly, to identify a representative sample of existing metaverse platforms, considering the myriad of virtual worlds out there. Next, to generate a collection of architecture representations such as floor plans, site images, and the design brief. And lastly, to invite architectural experts to verbally and graphically critique the metaverse using the representations from Phase 2. We first performed a scoping review of academic and popularized perspectives by searching for existing virtual worlds associated with the concept of a metaverse. The search pool was specifically filtered for the search term metaverse, narrowed by the keyword virtual reality, sorted by relevance, and framed within the past 2 years since conducting this study, namely 2021 to 2023. We then conducted a Google Trends analysis to identify the top 10 most popular metaverse platforms from our search pool. This was also filtered through our 5 characteristics of the metaverse mentioned before. The Google Popularity Index was used as a standardized metric to compare public interest across different platforms, considering the lack of consistent data regarding reported metaverse usage. However, this search pool does have its limitations, such as being biased for English queries and Google users and be susceptible to false positives. Now we selected our metaverse platforms, but which metaverse spaces should we choose? Each metaverse platform consisted of multiple interconnected virtual reality spaces. We explored each metaverse platform in virtual reality and selected the highest rated, featured, or occupied spaces at the time of access, and selected 3 spaces per metaverse. We then moved on to Phase 2 to generate architectural representations of the metaverse spaces, namely the architectural brief, the floor plan, and site images. The floor plans were the result of over 300 hours of manual drafting using standard architectural drafting practices, and over 200 screenshots were taken to carefully select a set of 3 based on a diversity of their spatial and atmospheric information. The 30 metaverse spaces selected were evenly distributed across the architectural typologies of interior, building, and plaza. When recruiting our architectural experts for Phase 3, we polled their architectural background to match the preferences for a selected typology: interior design for interiors, architecture for buildings, and urban planning for plazas. The purpose of these architectural representations was threefold: to draw explicit critiques rather than abstract generalizations of its most memorable parts, to exploit expert architectural knowledge using representations familiar to architects, to elicit not just verbal but also graphical critiques considering the spatial nature of designing virtual environments. And altogether, these architectural representations become a resource for spatial analysis. Thus, moving on to Phase 3, the user study. We individually invited architectural experts to participate and showed them 3 examples of metaverse spaces on floor plan, site images, and we described the design brief. We asked the expert to pick 1 metaverse space. Next, the architectural experts were invited to conduct a virtual reality site visit to experience the spatiality and atmosphere of the space firsthand. And lastly, we invited the architectural experts to both verbally and graphically critique the metaverse spaces using the floor plans and site images provided. Through thematic analysis, we have identified 5 architectural qualities regarding metaverse architecture based on opinions of our architectural experts. First is character, which refers to the expressive qualities of architecture to architect-like form, evoke atmosphere, and allow spaces to be recognizable. It was described by form, its 3-dimensional qualities, and material, its surfaces. In form, repetition discouraged exploration because navigating through repetitive space implied repeating spatial experiences, such as walking through many of the identical cell blocks in an office. And sometimes a lack of spatial hierarchy impeded wayfinding because there's no discernible order for the purpose or significance of spaces. In material, detail elicited realism. However, a lack of detail also impeded wayfinding because it became difficult to differentiate spaces. However, the lack of texture risked breaks in presence because it reminded participants of the artificiality of the virtual environment around them. Next, in habitation, which refers to the interaction between architectural space and its occupants. It was described by accessibility and proportionality. In accessibility, architecture that could be seen but not touched reduced spatial engagement when buildings only had decorative but not inhabitable purpose. For example, this building should also be seen but not entered. Architectural experts also preferred architectural affordances rather than reading text describing a space. In proportionality, out-of-scale proportion reduced spatial engagement due to the lack of activity or spatial elements relative to the space provided. For example, this public square was critiqued as being very, very wide. Moreover, out-of-scale proportion can also risk breaks in presence if spaces are perceived as unrealistically empty. Next, connectivity, which refers to articulating the adjacency of spaces, was described by connections to nature, enclosure, or circulation. In nature, biophilic elements promoted well-being and elicited joy by providing opportunities to connect with nature, such as framing a view to the mountains in an office environment to provide a mental break from work. In enclosure, while it can stimulate coziness, a lack of visual connection to an outdoor stimulated claustrophobia, especially with enclosed interior typologies with no windows. In circulation, poor circulation was created when transitional spaces interrupted the architectural program, but circular-centric plans, unusual in real life because circles are less space efficient than squares, was perceived as supportive of circulation, because they facilitated the flow of people to explore new spaces from a central focal point. Typology, which refers to the classification of buildings and urban spaces according to shared characteristics, functions, or forms, was described by its familiarity and ambiguity. The architectural experts note that the metaverse did often recreate or mimic real life, which elicited familiarity. In contrast, ambiguity occurred when a mismatch or deviation occurred between their real life and virtual reality representation. This could elicit confusion, but it could also introduce novelty when a real-life typology was adapted for VR purposes in a meaningful way. For example, an architectural expert described that they would not normally design shops in elevation, but appreciated that in the context of their visited space, it had the benefit of providing an overview of the shops when standing from the bottom of the stairway. Next, and lastly, functionality refers to the purpose of an architecture. For example, the functionalist approach of form follows function, and it was described by its practical and symbolic value. In practical value, much recreated metaverse architecture lost practical value when their VR representation no longer served their associated real-world function, like this virtual chair that you cannot actually sit on. Thus, symbolic value became more meaningful instead. Because recreated architecture elicited comfort or atmosphere when it borrowed from the contextual associations of real-life architecture, like this virtual fireplace, which evokes associations of the home and also comfort. From the thematic analysis of architectural qualities in the metaverse, we discern three overarching design conventions. Thus, in the opinion of our architectural experts, in the design convention representation, the visual appearance or manifestation of metaverse architecture versus real-life architecture was shaped by meaning. Aligned meaning referred to when the virtual reality representation recreated real life to become understandable and familiar. Misaligned meaning referred to when the VR representation did not mimic real life, risking becoming confusing and potentially discomforting because the architecture was too unfamiliar to understand. Augmented meaning refers to when the VR representation added to or augmented the real-life representation by viewing real-life archetypes with unfamiliar VR qualities, making the representation understandable yet imaginative. In the future, we foresee augmented design to potentially further deviate from real-life architecture as more unrealistic affordances in the metaverse become normalized with time. In the second design convention, engagement, the embodied interaction between a user and metaverse space was shaped by proportion. Architectural experts considered space should only be as large as to populate its ongoing activities, as unused space risked feeling empty and evoking an uninviting character. Yet metaverse architecture should also enact rhythms of space and mass to create opportunities for connectivity, switching between visual and navigational interaction, that is, to engage the user through the framing of views and a variation in transitions between open and enclosed space. And lastly, metaverse architecture should also leverage the proportion of familiar to unfamiliar architectural qualities to facilitate onboarding onto imaginative virtual reality representations, that is, for the so-called augmented representations from the previous slides. We expect that depending on the user's experience in the metaverse or virtual environments, metaverse architecture will need to gradually adjust the proportion of familiar to unfamiliar elements to aid the familiarization process. And in our last design convention, purpose, the motivation or intent behind the design of metaverse architecture was shaped by its phenomenological context. Now, what is this context? When metaverse architecture is stripped from its real-life considerations, constraints, and functionalities, what remains is to shape the subjective experience. Thus, metaverse architecture should exploit the provisional quality of this phenomenological context, that is, to take advantage of malleable space-time in the metaverse and evoke spaces that are specialized for a single, intense experience. Additionally, metaverse architecture should exploit the fact that avatars, as opposed to humans, are capable of interacting with the environment that would otherwise be considered unrealistic in real life, such as the lack of gravity and fall damage, or even teleporting. Of all design conventions, metaverse context deviated the furthest from reality and forms perhaps the strongest inspiration to provoke the future development of a more unconventional metaverse architecture. Thank you for watching.